Do you know one of the remarkable African explorers who I think epitomizes this notion of resilience is none other than David Livingstone, the missionary. A man born in Blantyre, who at age 10, working in a mill, used to have books open on his knee, studying whilst he was working in that mill, steam to stop the fabrics from breaking, great belts and noise. And this man was focused enough to be studying aspects of world history, world geography, indeed Christianity, and would eventually graduate young as a doctor. A man who came out to South Africa and went to Kuruman, to the Moffat mission. Now, if you haven't been to Moffat's mission in Kuruman, I recommend it highly. Robert Moffat built a T-shaped church at Kuruman out of wattle and daub with a thatched roof and a cow-dung floor, where with no electronic or acoustic help, standing at the altar in the middle of that T-shape, he could address 800 people. 800 people with no acoustic help or electronics in that beautiful, cool, shady thatched church in Kuruman. David Livingstone was no hunter. He was asked to deal with a man-eating lion nearby. He wounded the lion. The lion got hold of him by the shoulder and shook him, he said, like a terrier. He would later say that he felt no pain on account of the shock. And I want you to remember this because it's important later on in my story. Well, do you know that David Livingstone would indeed traverse parts of Africa, becoming more and more focused on removing the scourge of slavery from this continent and locating the source of the Nile than he was in spreading the word of the Bible and evangelizing local people? It was Livingstone who said, "I determined never to stop until I had come to the end and achieved my purpose." What a beautiful quote in terms of resilience or grit. A man who traversed South Africa and further north into Central Africa, East Africa, West Africa for 32 years. When the average age of an explorer on this continent was less than 18 months, he probably walked a total of 30,000 miles, nearly 50,000 kilometers during that career. His great body eventually gave out, probably from ulcers and internal bleeding, perhaps dysentery, in 1873. He died at a place called Lualaba on the edge of Lake Bangweolo. And two of his gracious, faithful, loyal porters, Susi and Chuma, decided to open up his body and remove his heart. The body was allowed to dry. It was salted. It was wrapped eventually into a pack to look like trade goods. And those two remarkable human beings carried that body more than 1,000 miles, 1,600 kilometers to Bagamoyo to be returned to England. They always said that you can have his body, but his heart belongs in Africa. And his heart indeed is buried at that lovely village, Lualaba, on the edge of Lake Bangweolo. But I think that David Livingstone is a man who in African terms epitomizes seeing things through. What can be done when your back is against the wall with the most basic of supplies, where there is no doubting that mindset is more important than mind. Well, I would like to tell you a little about a quite extraordinary human being called Douglas Mawson. He was born in Yorkshire, but of Australian parents, a man of incredible physique, unusually resourceful, a man of great energy, studied geology, a man who was lucky enough to be with Shackleton on the Nimrod expedition when they did a journey of more than 1,500 kilometers to find the South Magnetic Pole. Please be aware, ladies and gentlemen, that there's a major difference between geographic poles and magnetic poles, and the magnetic poles move. Mawson, with Edworth Davis and another man called Mackay, were the first to locate the South Magnetic Pole in 1908, early 1909. But do you know that only 3 years later, he was back in Antarctica with his own expedition off a ship called the Aurora. And Mawson wrote a book about that journey and that expedition called The Home of the Blizzard. because Cape Denison, where they set themselves up, was subjected to the most fearsome winds on earth, the katabatic winds that come down off the polar ice cap on account of gravity running down to the ocean on all sides. Winds that run at 200 miles, 320 kilometers an hour. They couldn't even put up a radio mast to hopefully make contact with Hobart in Tasmania on account of the wind. But they explored and made great surveys all over the area surrounding the land around the hut at Cape Denison. And Mawson eventually took off on a great expedition with two comrades, one called Javier Mertz, who was a doctor and a ski instructor from Switzerland, remarkable man and an incredible skier, and another called Lieutenant Belgrave Ninnis of a fine Guards regiment back in Britain. Ninnis was an impressive human being, wide-shouldered, looked like an international rugby player. Mertz much smaller, probably Mawson in the middle of the two, with an impressive physique and unusually resilient. Well, do you know that they put Ninnis at the back? He was heaviest with his team of dogs and his sled. On his sled were most of the food supplies and important supplies for the expedition. They were hoping that indeed Mertz, as the smallest, would make it over snow bridges, then Mawson, and they'd be warned of snow bridges covering crevasses. Well, Mertz looked back at one point and Mawson saw the horror on his face. And he turned and looked back behind and saw that there was no sign of Ninnis. They moved back to find that Ninnis and his team had disappeared soundlessly into a great crevasse. They looked with a telescope and could see two dogs on an ice ledge hundreds of feet below, both animals on the verge of death. One clearly had broken its spine. No sign of the sled, no sign of Ninnis, not a sound. Mawson was eventually obliged to read a funeral service next to that gaping hole, and the two continue, setting up a tent with the tripod legs of their sextant and theodolite that they were using for their geographic surveys. They're killing dogs, eating the dogs, trying to survive. And they did not know at that point that a husky's liver was easily as deadly as that of a polar bear because of the levels of vitamin A in the liver. It creates vitamin A poisoning. Well, Mertz was very reluctant to eat the dogs, but they were obliged to eat the dogs, given very little food left to try and survive. The easiest part of the dog to eat was indeed the liver, and in that gracious act, Mawson was in fact unwittingly and unknowingly poisoning Mertz. Mertz eventually went berserk. He was thrashing around with uncontrollable fits, repeatedly holding his head, screaming, couldn't sleep, got terrible dysentery. Try and imagine the horrors of trying to clean your comrade with dysentery in these circumstances. Well, eventually Mertz perished, and Mawson was obliged to continue alone, having killed the last of the dogs. He used a tiny little knife to cut up a sled and make it smaller to try and reduce the weight, and he was attempting to make his way back towards the hut at Cape Denison. 400 miles, 640 kilometers. Do you know that at one point his feet felt rather strange, so he took off his boots and the multiple socks they wore, and the soles of his feet came off. He simply smeared both surfaces with lanolin, bandaged the sole of his foot back onto his foot, and continued. At one point he fell into a crevasse, was saved by the little sled that stuck across the top of the crevasse, and had to pull his way back out with a rope, making loops in the rope to pull himself back up to the surface. How he never perished in that moment, I'll never know. An example of resilience second to none. Do you know when they got to Aladdin's cave, which was a great subterranean cave they had created with a huge amount of supplies, he arrived there 6 hours after the search party had left to return to the hut. When he got back to the hut at Cape Denison finally, this man who began the journey weighing 210 pounds was less than 100 pounds. He'd lost 110 pounds, more than half of his body weight. And the ship had left to go and pick up Wild and another party off to the west. And Mawson hair falling out, skin falling off, soles of his feet having come off, terrible ulcers and boils all over his body, was obliged to spend another winter, 4 months of complete darkness in Antarctica. If you think that times are difficult at this stage in our lives, give men and examples like this a thought. I think it's impossible even to describe the hardships and the resilience, the grit of these men who went before. And yet I think in the main that we should give ourselves a pat on the back for having survived thus far and no doubt going to survive into the future, given the challenges and the circumstances facing us. And I would like to finish with a little South African story, if I may, of a remarkable human being called Harry Voliter, who was a ranger in the Kruger National Park. You know, it was that extraordinary human being, Stephanus Johannes Paulus Krier, Paul Kruger, who realized that if this unabated hunting continued, with all the transport riders coming up from Lorenzo Marx through the Lowveld, up the escarpment and onto the goldfields around Johannesburg, if they continued to destroy and eat the game, we'd end up with no game at all. So he began with what was initially the Sabi-Wildtuin, the Sabi Game Reserve, between the Sabi and the Sand Rivers, still one of the most prolific wildlife areas in South Africa. One of the early wardens was a man called Stevenson Hamilton, and one of his rangers was a tough man called Harry Voliter. I often describe Voliter as being like a saddlebag with eyes. There wasn't an ounce of fat on him. Everyone said if you gave him a rifle, saddlebags and a horse, he'd be ready to leave anywhere at an hour's notice. And he was riding a patrol on the eastern side of the Kruger Park, off to the southeast of Chokwane in August of 1903. He was riding a horse. He had two of his dogs with him, a larger one called Bull, a bit like a Ridgeback, and a smaller terrier type called Fly. He had policemen with him with donkeys, with all the supplies on the donkeys. And they got to a waterhole, having had a drink all day at noon, to find the waterhole empty. The only way forward was to proceed another 8 miles, 12 kilometers to the next waterhole, and hope to find water there. Voliter took off ahead on his horse, with Bull following him. Fly remained with the policeman on foot, leading the donkeys, who would follow up behind. And eventually it got dark. August, the days are short, the nights are long and cold. And he was riding through an area that was burnt. Before I continue with the story, it would be fair to say that Voliter was carrying on his belt a knife. A knife called the pipe brand knife, made in Smithfield in London. There was at the time what I would call a Chinese or a pirate copy of a pipe brand knife, which Voliter had, because he couldn't afford a genuine pipe brand knife, which was indeed the holy grail of knives. That is what you wanted if you were interested in knives and cutlery. Now this here is a 100% replica of the pipe brand knife that Voliter was carrying that evening. The knife he had seen on a cheese board with some cheese at a trading store in Leidenburg. And he indeed felt that the store owner didn't need such a top quality knife, and his pirate copy would not be noticed if he swapped the two around. And when he put the genuine pipe brand knife into the sheath, it was a little loose. He had around his middle a belt, just like this one. I've had this belt especially made to illustrate this story, which is an integral part of South African folklore. He's riding through this burnt country. There are patches of unburnt vegetation, animals rushing from them, which he thought were reedbuck, which were quite popular in that area. Suddenly some animals are rushing in the darkness, and Voliter realizes that they are not reedbuck, indeed they are lions. 2 lions. One has run up alongside of his horse on the right-hand side, when suddenly there's an almighty thump, and the second lion lands on the hindquarters of his horse. His horse bucks and rears, and bucks Voliter right out of the saddle onto the top of the lion running alongside of his horse, hoping to get hold of his horse's throat. It was at that point that his rifle flew out of the scabbard, and that lion, going for his horse's throat, grabbed him by the right shoulder and began to drag him away. Voliter said, in this moment, I could hear my horse taking off, with the first lion on its tail, and Bull in turn chasing the lion. Try to imagine the scene. Voliter's wearing spurs. He's been riding a horse. The spurs get stuck in the dry earth. And every time they get stuck, the lion gives him a jerk to get him moving again. He said the pain was excruciating. And it was at this point I want you to remember Livingstone. Because Voliter said, I disagreed vehemently with Livingstone, that the shock in turn creates no pain. I was in searing pain. The dew claws on the lion's limbs are tearing at the ligaments and muscles in his forearms and in his calves. And he knew that if the lion knew he was alive, it would probably drop him and grab him by the head, and it would be game over. He's got his face pushed up into the lion's mane. The smell must have been overwhelming. But he said the purring of that lion was very disconcerting, obviously looking forward to this human dinner. And Voliter suddenly remembered the knife. But the knife fitted loosely in the sheath. And indeed, the chances were good that the knife had flown out of the sheath when he was bucked off the horse. So he moves his left hand, he's right-handed. He moves his left hand around his back to his right hip, where the knife was always carried. Try to imagine the moment for him when his hand closes around the sheath of his beloved pipe brand knife. And he brings the knife back around between himself and the lion's chest. And he moves his left hand, his weak hand, round behind the lion's shoulder. He's now feeling with his little finger for the ribs of the lion, knowing that he had to try and strike between the ribs 2 and 3 into the lion's heart for the best chance of success. Suddenly he stabs twice between rib 2 and 3 with that knife, and then upward directly above him, hoping to hit the jugular vein of the lion. It was clearly successful, because he's suddenly covered with arterial blood. The lion lets out a horrible cough, drops him, and moves off spluttering, making the most terrible noises. Voliter immediately realizes that the second lion may not have caught his horse and may be back to eat him. He looks for a tree with limbs close enough to the ground that he could get up into that tree. He finds one in the dark. He climbs up into that tree, realizes he's not far off the ground, but he doesn't have time to look for another tree. He's about to faint from shock and pain and loss of blood. He undoes his belt and does the belt up round the bough of the tree to keep him in the tree. Not long before the second lion is back at the base of the tree, he's heard the one he stabbed, has died. The second lion could probably reach him quite easily in that tree. But Bull, brave Bull, man's best friend, is rushing at the lion, and the lion would indeed rush the dog. And the lion was distracted long enough by the dog for the policeman to arrive. Voliter shouts at them that there's a lion nearby. They set the felt alight, terrified of lions, beating pots, trying to make as much noise as they could to drive the lion away. They were successful. Eventually, they have to get Voliter out of the tree. The wounds had stiffened. He said the pain to get out of that tree was excruciating. Now, if you want a story about resilience and persistence, they still had 4 miles to the waterhole they were aiming for that Voliter walked that night. They got to that waterhole to find it empty. He said, I would have paid 3 months' salary happily for a glass of cool, clear water that night. His policemen, fine, decent human beings, went off in search of water. They came back with little more than mud. They went back the following morning to skin the lion, recovered his rifle, which he was very pleased to get back. And they believed that the best treatment for lion wounds is to boil up the skull of the lion and treat the wounds with that concoction, which Voliter said later clearly made the septicemia and the infection of his wounds much worse. He was carried in a mochila, 2 long poles with a blanket in between, by his policeman to the ranger post, eventually got to the hospital in Komatipoort, where the doctors were sure he would die 4 days after the attack. His shoulder smelling so bad, he said he had to turn his head the other way on account of the smell. He lived. He prayed that he would still be able to lift his hand high enough to fire a rifle. That prayer was answered. He was able to return to his duties as a ranger. And I've always thought that if you wanted a story of resilience and grit in this country, think about that remarkable man, Harry Voliter, and the lion attack in the Kruger National Park in August of 1903. And I think that we should all think and reflect upon these times, the issue of resilience, where mindset is more important than mind, and can we indeed make it through these challenging times? I believe we can. And I hope indeed that you've enjoyed these few little examples of persistence, of resilience, of grit in history, and that they indeed inspire you to acts of great resilience in your own lives, in your families, in your business. And I hope one day that our paths will cross again. Stay well. Thank you for your attention. Goodbye.